Good evening. I'd like to start this Monday, December 3rd, school board work session. And if Ms. Tuttle could call the roll, please.
Mrs. Sanderson?
Yes, here.
Mr. Rice is expected. Mrs. Lambert? By phone? Ms. McConnell is excused. Ms. Marati?
Here.
Mr. Warren?
Here.
Mrs. Dominique?
Here.
The board has a quorum.
Thank you. Mission statement. Our mission is to provide an excellent, equitable, go mute. Our mission statement. Our mission is to provide an excellent, equitable education in a safe, supported environment so all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse and changing society. Already had the roll call. Just have one thing I need to say before we get started. And keep it to yourself or write it down on a piece of paper. But I need you to give me an answer to this question. What 10-letter word starts with gas? Write it down. Don't say it out. When you figure it out, we'll get the answer at the end. Just getting you to thinking, starting out. Okay. Now we'll go into our work session, December the 3rd. And Dr. Gaborg, I'll pass it off to you and Assistant Superintendent Sean Kraska.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the memo, just a couple pages in. I'm actually not going to go through this whole thing right now because I think this is after you hear the report from Education Northwest. These are some of the things that we want to talk about. Mostly I just want to thank Education Northwest for partnering with us. It's been a great experience, and this is one of the, when you try to do a huge project like this and this type of research and have something with this type of stakeholder engagement, it's not something that we have the capacity to do internally. When we got rid of our research and evaluation department a few years ago, we feel the hit in lots of areas, and doing this type of proactive project where you really think about making systemic changes based on, again, a lot of research and a lot of stakeholder engagement is, you need a good partner to help you with that. And Education Northwest, I actually, of course, anybody who's been in education has worked with them. They've been around for decades, but I was especially impressed with the work that they did in Oregon around some of the very specific discipline changes that state has gone through. And since they served Oregon, I thought they might be able to help us with our update. And then just to provide a little background, this is something, I think it was, Sean and I tracked this down, it's been more than 15 years, or in the 15-year range since we have updated our student discipline system. So I think it's time, thinking around best practices with regard to student behavior have significantly changed. And that's everything from, minor infractions to major infractions. We've made slight adjustments to policy over time as the school board felt that we needed to, but it definitely feels like it's time for, felt like it was time for a systemic look and hopefully eventually a systemic change and an update to our discipline system. So I just want to thank them. And then we can come back to this memo when we're done, and it might be a sort of a jumping off point for the discussion, because there's a list of things that we can do short term, I think, to address some what I perceive as fairly immediate needs, and then some long term work that we can do to really get at updating our entire discipline system and how we serve students when they do have some of these infractions that we see in our schools. There's a ton of information in this packet available for you, and also links online. There's discipline trend data. There's appendices with lots of the survey feedback. So we provided kind of the baseline report here, but there's lots available for school board members at the links and online for the public too, if you really want to dig in and look at it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ed Northwest and let them take it from here.
All right, thank you so very much. Good evening, and thank you to the school board, and really thank you to the Office of the Superintendent for supporting us over these last 15 months. My name is Trevor Saponis, and I'm here with my colleague Vicki Nishioka from Education Northwest. And the first thing that we are going to do is going to get our PowerPoint on the overhead for everyone to see.
Yeah.
Do you want questions as we go through the PowerPoint or wait till the end?
That's an excellent point. I'm going to invite questions as we go along. I think it'll make sense to have an organic conversation. And what I'll be doing is I'll be providing kind of an overview of how we got here, the work that we've been doing over the last year and a half, before I turn it over to my colleague to talk more about kind of the research and the nationwide trends around the discipline practices and policies that are going around nationwide, so we can give you the full picture of what we've done here and what other people are doing all over. I never like to let technology stymie a presentation, so I'm just going to go ahead and share. The first slide is a very inviting picture of our 3 team members. So that is myself. Again, my name is Trevor Saponis. I'm a former high school English and journalism teacher, a former district administrator who worked on teacher training and evaluation. Before I've been most recently Education Northwest, working on whole school transformation and a lot around discipline policies. It comes up over and over, whether I'm working with an individual high school or whether I'm working with an individual district. On our phone is Bernie Sorensen, who has over 40 years of experience, mostly based in Juneau, and I'll let Vicki introduce herself when I turn the presentation over to her. The second thing, to give you a little indication of where we've been. Here we are. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the overview of the Safe and Supportive Schools project. We're going to share the report findings. We'll discuss the recommendation, and hopefully by the end of today, we will talk about potentially identifying some next steps. So just to give you a little bit of background, we wanted to present a collaborative stakeholder engagement process that allowed us to inform these decisions. Again, it's been a number of years since these discipline practices have been updated, and a lot has happened both here and nationwide. And that's the framework for where we began. And so we really wanted to be able to come here today to be able to talk about the shared vision and how to align that policy to the work that we've been doing, so that we really can, as we always do, and it's always nice, thank you for sharing with the mission statement, to support all of our students, K through 12 and beyond. This just gives you a little bit of background. This started back in November of 2017, where we started to engaging our stakeholders and saying, what are your values and what is the current situation? And we've moved through these different phases, and especially most recently, they've overlapped in a lot of really interesting and productive ways. But we're here excited to talk about what we found. It's not. So I should just say next slide. Can we go to the next slide? So just to tell you a little bit about the elements of the process and how we thought about this, we wanted to combine both family and community experiences and insights, and we did a lot of that through our initial phase with focus groups. Also, which really generates the collective wisdom of the community. Of course, we asked our educators, particularly we paid special attention both to teachers as well as administrators within the school. And then we wanted to bring in research, both local and national trends. So if we could, next slide. One of the things I'd like to do right now is to take a step back and think about the first thing that we did. And I'm going to invite you to just quickly peruse pages 6, 7, and 8 in the report as part of your packet. We conducted a series of 7 focus groups and conversations over our first meetings in November, and we asked the same 6 questions to each group. And it was really instructive and really provided us with the foundation for the project as a whole. So I just want to quickly go over some of these. The first thing that we found is that there were a number of strengths that were already at play here in the district. Numerous stakeholders and numerous meetings identified annual events, particularly around transition, such as Ignition Day, highlights around student-led events, student-driven programs, such as the Military Student Ambassador Program, the Sources of Strength Program, as well as various Alaska Native education events. And so there were a lot of strengths that were very encouraging to hear about how, moving into question 2, the school climate. So for the most part, students and the people around schools described a good school climate. I think what was most interesting is the extent to which it varied school to school. So while a number of them reported things very positively, there were other individuals at certain schools who reported different experiences. And that's certainly something that we thought about when we were moving forward in our process. Question 3 is around how discipline was handled in the district. And this is where stakeholders describe the district as having a progressive discipline system, meaning that discipline issues are counted cumulatively against a student. And this was a source of frustration for many of the stakeholders. Some cite it as both unfairness and inconsistency, as well as a lack of flexibility. What was most interesting, I would say, was also the focus group with the district administrators who felt that there was very little flexibility, and they consulted their student rights handbook to basically give them guidance on exactly what they should do. That resulted in many out-of-school suspensions. Looking forward to question 4. Once we looked at what we wanted the discipline process to look like, there was a lot around transparency and clear communication. And while that happened in fits and starts and in certain pockets, it wasn't consistent across the district or in the stakeholder feedback that we were getting. The recommendations that they were making around these practices and policies were all over the place. I think this was one of the most interesting areas in the survey that we'll get to. While some were advocating for major revisions and others were advocating for very small tweaks, but there was a general understanding that there were certain things that could and should move forward. The last question on page 8 is around what does it look like? And I just want to focus that a lot of the feedback that we got was to have student engagement and inclusion in the discipline process, as well as it making it a learning experience for them. So that was really what set the stage for our survey work. So I'm going to take a pause really quickly here and just ask if there are any questions around that first stage around the focus groups and the questions and the findings that we found.
I don't see any hands going up, but I have one question. I wasn't able to get through the whole packet. What groups were involved with the answers that we received?
For the focus group specifically, I believe on page 5 it describes the focus groups that we were able to convene and who was in attendance at those.
And they answered all those questions that you have on the following pages, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Dorn.
Okay. In relation to that, and before we go too far up on those,
Yep.
I've got a question. Okay. It's a different one. So in terms of those focus groups, what was the composition of the groups? And I'm primarily interested in students, but so let's start with that one. And those were all face-to-face focus groups, is that correct?
That is correct. They were face-to-face in this very building over the course of 3 days in November of last year. And so the compositions were, again, one group of students, one group of principals. And
okay, what was the composition of students?
I can speak to that. We had middle and high school students participating in that. We did not have elementary students.
Okay, and about how large a group?
I think there were 12. I can go back and look. I think there were 12 high school students. More were invited. We had 12 students participate at high school. I think 9 for middle school.
Okay, thank you. And relative to that composition of the students who are involved, were at some point in the process, were any of the affected groups, I'm thinking of students who often have experienced the disciplinary process and getting their feedback. I'm thinking, forum for that is smart students, or others who have been through and as stakeholders have their.
So specific to the focus groups, without naming names, just a little bit of process, we did have to seek parent permission to ask for them to participate in this and to understand the nature of what we were doing. And we invited all SMART students to participate. Not all SMART students did. And then we invited students who had been impacted through school discipline in some manner at middle and high schools. The invite was for more than that. Those that participated were the ones that either made their way down there or parents gave permission. So the students who participated had been impacted in some manner by some level of school discipline. I don't have that on a sheet in front of me, but
okay.
That was kind of the general idea. Like, we should probably be talking to kids who had some type of discipline or who had experienced the discipline process in some manner so that they were able to speak to it. And opposed to someone who had never been in any kind of trouble at school and might not have any context to talk around that. Did I answer that? Okay.
Yes,
okay.
Actually, which I would not go to the flip side of that.
Okay.
Was, were students who have generally not had difficulties also as part of a focus group? Or I'm really pleased that this was it sounds like it was primarily affected students.
I would say for the focus group, no. Again, I would want to go back and check my notes on that, Mr. Dorn. However, and I think Trevor and Vicki and Bernie will speak to it later after the focus groups, the surveys that went out that helped develop some of the themes and the recommendations that we're looking at tonight, those were given to all students district-wide, and all students had an opportunity to give input to that.
Okay, and parent
Same
also
with parents.
affected parents?
Yes.
Were the predominant?
Not as strong participation, but invited to participate.
Okay. Dozen people? Or thereabouts?
I would say less than 12 affected parents, but through all of the focus groups, more parents. Just maybe not all affected parents, like parents of kids who've been in SMART or parents of kids who've had more than one suspension. But I would say we had parents who were part of several of the focus groups, not just the parent focus groups. We had PTAs at the elementary, middle, and high school. We had just parents who were invited in general. We had parents who were in other focus groups serving in other roles who also acknowledged that they were parents when they were answering.
Great, thank
you.
So
across all the focus groups, I would say we had several parents. Can I take 1 minute? As an example, we had a parent who was from the public defender's office, and we had a judge in one of our focus groups, and he was a parent. So.
Great, thank you.
Ms. Anderson?
Demographics of the group that participated? What were the demographics?
We need you to speak in the mic.
What were the demographics of those students and families that participated?
So I'd have to get you that information later.
I might recommend if there's really detailed questions about process, if you'll send those to us, we can get that answer to you. Otherwise, we're going to be here till 10 o'clock because there's a lot of information. So.
Excellent. Thank you for those questions. So what we did is, using the emerging themes that we garnered from the stakeholder groups, we launched a survey. The survey garnered over 1,000 responses and had extensive representation from all different stakeholder groups. We've shared that information. We've also shared the raw data with the office, so this is something that you'll have forever. So if anyone in the few coming months has very specific questions about that, you have access to the raw data to answer any of those questions. But what we did to begin with, and I'll draw your attention to page 15, is we really wanted to build upon the value statements that emerged from the focus group. So we asked all of our stakeholders to identify the 5 most important values in driving the creation, implementation, and evaluation of the district practices in creating safe and supportive schools. Not surprisingly, the first was safety for all students, with over 80% of respondents responding that was a top priority. But it's interesting to think about the next few. Rules and consequences are used consistently for all students. Clear communication from staff, a process that is a learning opportunity for students and supportive of academic achievement. And it was interesting that those really reflected a lot of the emerging themes from the focus groups. So what we did is that we generated our questions to see if what our findings in the focus group were consistent. So at this point, if we could begin slowly scrolling through some of the survey results.
You have a question before you start?
Yep.
Mr. Dorn has a question before you start scrolling.
Yes, I'm interested. It's data-driven rather than data-informed, but I'm glad you added data process later on. But the question I have, so I don't get down in the weeds too much, but so I understand the demographics. There, you had 1,069. When you did your demographic breakout, that's based on the percentage of responses identified in that group of the 1,069. Is that correct?
That's correct. I believe so.
And do we have a ballpark? And I assume the survey was only sent to middle and high school students.
Nope. Sean, you can answer that. But it was a survey available to all community members in the same way.
Okay, so elementary students could have answered it?
Yes.
Okay.
And their parents.
And community members.
Do we have a ballpark of, let's say, student, parent, staff number? So we got 1,069 out of, the community one I know is just completely open, but so it'd be out of 25,000 potential. If we take students, teachers, staff, parents.
Are you wanting
I'm not sure what you're wanting. Are you wanting it by school
on page
or
12?
No, I don't need it broken down, just the total. So an approximate total.
So
we'd have
on page 12, I believe. Is that
right.
what you're
That's
looking for?
only reflective of the 1,069. Not of
So you want to know what percentage of respondents?
respondents, right? So our response rate I'm estimating a quick ballpark of about 25,000 potentials. So I'm just trying to get an idea of.
We could get that for you if
we
you would
could.
like that.
Okay. Thanks.
So I think it'll be helpful at this point just to look through some of the major findings that we found. So of course, if safety was the most important thing, we wanted to ask, are schools safe for everyone? And again, this information was combined where strongly agree and agree were grouped together and strongly disagree and disagree were grouped together. If you're very interested, we've provided the raw information so you can find that, but this is one of the most helpful ways to give a quick overview of that. So we have a 46 to 54 breakdown. All students are welcomed in their school. This was more positively responded and consistent between stakeholder groups. Student-to-student interactions are almost always positive, close to 50-50. Teacher-student actions are almost always positive. And this question also reflected on some of the strengths that were identified in some of the focus groups and in some of the comments that this seems to be one of the strengths, the teacher-student interactions. Parent-teacher interactions are almost always positive. Again, a strength. Parents have positive interactions with the schools. This is an interesting question that kind of reflects some of the emerging research that some of the questions are, when parents only have negative interactions, what happens? So are there opportunities for them to engage with schools in positive ways? And the overwhelming majority said yes. Bullying is a problem in schools. So this was something that emerged from our focus groups questions, and this was really one of the flags that our team identified. This is a very high number in the strongly agree category. This is something that my colleague Vicki will talk about in more detail, but this was something that really everyone on our team identified quickly and said, this is a flag, this is something that needs to be addressed.
Can I ask a question on that?
Absolutely.
I know you've been to a lot of different places, and you probably have seen this number come up pretty high just about everywhere you go. I think a big part of that, I'm not going to say that it isn't a high number. I think bullying needs to be defined, because people tend to want to put everything to bullying, and it may or may not be bullying. Is that what you see when you go across and you try to explain these high numbers when it comes back to bullying?
Vicki?
I think one of the problems with bullying is there are two ways to think about it. One is a clinical definition of bullying, and yeah, you're right, not everything rises to the level of a clinical definition of bullying, but there are, within a school, if you have a number of students that are engaging in the types of what we call bullying behaviors, it becomes a very difficult thing, not just for the students directly involved, but for the students who experience it or observe it. So it becomes, I think bullying affects everybody within a school, not just the two players, or the students who is aggressing and the students who's the target of bullying, and that's what becomes a problem. So when students say it's a big problem, it's because it's a problem for bystanders because they don't know what to do. It creates anxiety for them, and they're worried that if they intervene, they'll be bullied themselves. They're also worried that if they don't intervene, they feel a bit helpless, and they feel like they haven't really responded or helped. Students who are the aggressors, of course, have very strong negative outcomes based on their behaviors, and also students who are targets may or may not have difficult situations, a lot depending on the nature of the bullying. And I think one of the things that we often don't recognize, and I think teachers and students, is how serious it is. But if a student experiences 2 incidents of bullying a month, they may have lifelong consequences from it. And the bullying doesn't, when we think about bullying, sometimes we think about it, students that are being very physically harmed, but a lot of times bullying is much more subtle, and it's the relational harm of being called names, being ignored, being teased in a cruel way that we sometimes don't think is as harmful as it is. So I think this number, as you're right, it comes up very frequently because it's not just the 2 students, it's really the whole school that becomes affected by it.
Mr. Dorn.
That's the question I had on this, what your definition of bullying is. And in your example, you're still giving a pretty narrow definition of bullying. And yes, if 2 or 3 people, small group, are involved in bullying, which is a more targeted, pervasive situation, it does have a ripple effect. There's no question about that. But in terms of the question itself, is it if I call another person a name, if I call Sean a name, am I bullying her? Or am I calling her a name and teasing her? Yeah, it could be, and how often I do it. But I think that's the problem, and as when we've done surveys in the past, and the reason why this becomes a very important one is because this becomes a focus point as you go through your report. And I think that becomes a very important issue for our schools. If our schools are this bad, we've got a whole different problem, especially depending upon what we mean by bullying and how it's perceived, and whether we, so I've watched parents, because I've asked this question specifically in our parent surveys, and it's a very different answer when you talk specifically about bullying, or you talk about are they respecting each other types of things. And so
It's definitely
need to
good
be
to
careful.
look at multiple places of
Talking
data.
to your mic, please.
Multiple places of data. We do have our school climate survey with the district done every year for students in grades 5 through 12, and there are a sequence of bullying questions specifically addressing that. I'll read a few of these. Students at this school are teased or picked on about their race or ethnicity. Students are teased or picked on about their cultural background. Students are teased or picked on about their physical or mental disability. Students at this school are teased or picked on about their real or perceived sexual orientation. Students at this school are often bullied. Students at the school try to stop bullying. And students often spread rumors or lies about others at this school on the internet. That's the set of questions that defines our bullying topic within our school climate. And so I think that's another piece of data to look at when we're having that kind of general conversation about bullying.
Ms. Moratti.
The 73%, and I'm assuming you guys work with schools, districts all over. So is that 73%? How does that relate to other schools or trends that you see?
I think that nationally and other schools, we see about the same. 70 to 80% of schools are identifying bullying as an issue in their school. They may have different ways of engaging or different outcomes depending on whether they're the witnesses, whether they are engaged in or targeted, but I think that statistic is pretty strong. I think what happens, though, it's hard to understand because people work on this in a very real and hard ways, and so I think they have to have feedback directly from students within their buildings to really understand that yes, it is here and that we need to address it. And I think it's a really good idea to understand the many forms of bullying. And as we begin to build our understanding of cyberbullying or electronic aggression and how that can affect, that really opens up a whole different kind of way of reaching many, many people, far more than just individual confrontation. So I think that this statistic is really strong and we should believe it. It doesn't mean that 73% of students are engaging in bullying or targeted by bullying, but 73% says that they don't like it in their schools and they would like help to stop it.
Well, I'm not going to be with her the questioning, going through the questions right now, but if I could put a little note to say that we'll come back to this, or you're going to go into more definition or more explanation on this, because I do have a few more questions on it, and I just want us to keep moving.
Yep.
Okay?
We can definitely do that, and I just want to quickly say we had a 2-day series of meetings with the leadership team, and we really delved into this issue. So there are a number of people in this room who are a part of that, and I think we should engage some of their voices at a future date. If we could look at the next question. Again, the issue of bullying and racism came up. This was close and consistent with some of the other ones. I just also want to point out, if you look in your actual packet, you'll look at some of the subgroups. And what was interesting around this question is that there was consistent answering regardless of demographics, meaning students of color answered the same as white students. As well, basically all demographic groups answered consistently to that question.
When you make that statement, I'm sorry, Mr. Dorn, hold on 1 second. When you make that statement that students of color and Caucasian students answered in the same manner, are you stating that the Caucasian students recognize that there is racism? Is that what you're saying?
I'm just saying that basically within a few percentage points, 50% of Caucasian students answered this question in the strongly agree, as well as 50% of students of color answered strongly agree or disagree. That's one of the easiest ways, or just one of the ways that's consistently used to say, someone else just brought this up, let's look at the affected populations. So, for instance, racism usually works against people of color, so we should be sure to value their voices. And so I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm just saying that the answers are consistent from those two student groups.
Mr. Dorn.
General question on these questions and the numbers on them. These are K-12, is that right?
So our survey was to all 1,000 people, and so these are, everyone is included in all of these responses. So that can be students, parents, teachers, administrators, everyone is included.
Do you elsewhere in the information you've gathered have any breakdown that would reflect elementary, middle, high, and so that if in any of these areas we wanted to look at, one section is doing pretty well, let's not mess with that. Other area, well, we've really got work to do, that type of thing, that helps.
We did not break it down in that way. We broke it down as students as a whole, teachers as a whole, administrators as a whole. However, you do have that information, and you could very easily do that given the demographic information that we requested.
Okay, and this is the total 1,069, all the groups?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
We could go to the next slide. So we asked a series of questions around how it's operating and how well it serves students. The discipline process helps students learn from their mistakes. This was a minor flag for our team in terms of the disparity between 38 and 62%.
I think those are good numbers, but I would really like to talk to those kids that think that process is that great, because we would like to avoid them from getting into the trouble. So maybe if we could come up with some things that would stop somebody from getting into trouble.
Absolutely. And you're previewing some of the things we're going to talk about by just a minute. So just a few more. Students have a voice in the discipline process. Overwhelmingly disagreeing with that statement. Current discipline process supports all students. Again, a larger percentage disagreeing. The current discipline process handles misbehavior consistently. This was really something, again, I found the most fascinating listening to both groups of teachers and administrators talking about how even what's identified as misbehavior is different from room to room. I'll say in the interest of time. Current discipline system has fair punishments, 46 to 54. And before, if we could just go back up one. Thank you. Before we get to the recommendations, are there any questions about some of the survey response items that we just went over?
Just to double check if I'm reading this right, for the question 17, item 17, you have data where you're talking about how the different groups responded. And so like you had 29% agree and or strongly agree for the whole group, but then it says for like students, for example, it was 50% and administrators were 51%. Am I reading that right?
That's correct. So we wrote in sentence form how different groups responded, and we did our best to really identify the outliers. And I think I encourage all of you to read that. There's some interesting findings there about how different stakeholder groups feel differently about these questions, and we wanted to give the overarching overview here, but I think that's another way to dig into some of these things.
Can I ask on your project report, page 22, again, to understand the numbers on these, it's referencing question 23.
The district has a unifying vision for how discipline practices should be used.
Thank you for bringing that right up. So this particularly hit me by the time I hit this one. Maybe it's because it seems to be clearer in my mind. My question, could you explain how almost all the groups, roughly a third of each of the groups, except for students, disagreed, but yet on the totality, almost 2/3 disagreed. What goes to me, and my math may be wrong, but if a third of the group disagree, then that would indicate that 2/3 agree, and I would assume that it would show in the total. And since the student one is just a little bit off at a 50% mark, it still doesn't explain. Could you explain that mathematical for me?
It's disparities in the number of respondents. So we could have a situation where administrators strongly disagreed with everything, and just because I think there were probably 40 respondents of administrators, they're not going to shake the overall weighting of the other 1,000 respondents. And so that's really, I think it's interesting and useful to think about a question like survey item 23. The district has a unifying vision, particularly for the administrators, who are the ones charged with enacting and implementing that vision. And just so you know, this was...
So am I correct in assuming that 2/3 of the administrators agreed with that statement? Given your sentence above.
37% of administrators either agreed or disagreed.
No,
strongly
they disagreed.
So the majority
disagreed.
That is correct.
Okay, the sentence says that they disagreed. 37% disagreed, so that means 63% agreed that it had a unifying.
I believe you're reading that correctly.
Okay, so all of those groups, except for the students, all the subgroups, 2/3 agreed that it has a but yet when we come down, we have the reverse. And it doesn't make sense. And if you can show me the math later on, I'd be happy.
I can show you the math.
So we don't. But it does not make sense to me, and that's why I'm wondering as I work through these. Thank you.
Okay, I'll star that and follow up. Are there any overarching questions before we dive into the recommendations? Great. So if we could go to the next slide. So we made these 5 recommendations intentionally at a high level, meaning I think once you see the superintendent's memo, that's at a different level. And so we made these so that these were overarching, and there were a number of things that could operate within them. I don't want to read them word for word, but I think our strongest recommendation was to rewrite or remove current guidelines on disciplinary consequences that remove students from classroom instruction. And the second one that I really want to focus on is number 2, a new set of guidelines that provide specific early intervention and prevention strategies. This already came up here this evening, so thank you for that. And this is really what we spent a lot of the time in the leadership team meeting. We also brought a number of examples of what other districts are doing, and I think what the leadership team found most interesting is that while there were disciplinary consequences, there were also explicit disciplinary supports for each of those infractions. So as it's written now, that's not exactly how the handbook works. And so from a national perspective, that's what a lot of other districts are doing, and that provides a lot more support for those administrators and teachers who are acting. So it's not just simply having them leave the room and then leave the school for a set number of days based on an infraction. We have to ask the question, how are we going to prevent that behavior in the future and support them through all of their academic experiences?
Mr. Doyle?
Just a thought for administration in terms of that number 2. All the things that individual schools do that already provide a very positive, proactive approach, and I'm thinking, some schools have done families, ignition is one, what's the challenge day that we've talked about and some of the high schools do, it's different at each level, but I think there's so many of those that we don't lose sight there. We think of discipline as the punitive side of things, where discipline is how we kind of organize, order our lives. It's a very positive, constructive piece, and that we make sure that we recognize, as we look at this big picture, recognize that side of the ledger that's going on, whether they're peer mediators, whether they're playground aides, students helping in the playground. Schools call them different things and stuff, but I think that we take some time to look at that side of the ledger.
My question was to rewrite the current guidelines. Is that something that we're going to have an example of in here, or is it something that the administrators need to get back together and decide how you're going to revamp it?
So I spoke to that in my memo. I think there's a couple things, again, that I recommend that we look at in the short term, and then that we convene next fall a discipline task force and go through the entire chapter on student discipline and look, dive into this data and dive into these recommendations and have a group work on updating the policy in ARs.
Because I don't think everything that we're doing should be rewritten. I think some of the things are pretty good, and with this saying rewrite and remove, I'm thinking you all are going to start from ground zero again, start all over. I just don't see that being necessary. I see there are places where there need to be changes somewhat, but to rewrite it just to rewrite it, I just don't see that as necessary.
And so, so I think that'll need to be some of the conversation with the board. Again, I think the national trend is to, in fact, some states have legislated that there are only a very few, like 2 or 3 consequences where a student can be suspended out of school. Everything else has to be handled in school. With that, however, you have to have supports in the buildings. So,
number one, money.
I mean, any rewriting of this will also, which I think is what you were, explicit intervention, not for some students, like Challenge Day is 100 kids in a school, right? So 100 kids get that experience. Ignition is for freshmen. That's a transition piece, right? There's, but a systemic approach to addressing discipline issues. And if you want to keep kids in school and change the behavior, then you're going to have resources to do that. So what I imagine is a task force putting together sort of a systemic recommendation for the board, and then the board's going to have to.
Mr. S., did you have your hand up before I call Mr. Dorn?
No.
Okay, I thought that was okay, Mr. Dorn.
Quick question on number 5. Is the district still using the behavior logs?
Yes, in Power School.
So at this point, I would like to transition to my colleague Vicki. So hopefully you got the overview of the project that we just presented and the series from focus groups, and using that information to create our survey to then create our recommendations for what we think could best serve all students. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Vicki, who can give you a little bit more of the national lens on this issue.
I know that we're short on time, so I'm going to ask you to do time checks on me, but I wanted to give you some background about zero tolerance and what that means, because it's really what we're seeing when we talk about a systemic shift. We're really rethinking school discipline and what makes it work. And I appreciated the comment that most people, when they think of discipline, they think about punitive consequences, and in reality, discipline means that we teach students. And it really is about teaching. And so I think that the focus and that we're coming through the value statements really does reflect some of our rethinking, is that we should be teaching students, and our philosophy is that we should be teaching students social emotional learning and social expectations with the same level of rigor that we teach academic instruction, that it may be different, and so that we need to begin to set up school environments that will allow students to learn within that. And so, but zero tolerance really came into being when as a reaction to some pretty tragic events, and where we began to look at zero tolerance, meaning that if students did something wrong that was unsafe for schools, they should be removed from the school building. And so that started out in the late 70s, and we began to look at in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, and removing students to interim alternative settings. Most of the expulsions, most of the removals are really out-of-school suspensions. And one of the things that happened, and as we began to look at it 20 years after we saw the emergence of zero tolerance taking over as the approach for school discipline, is we began to see that we were using exclusionary discipline, removing students at much higher rates. We began to see that we were using it disproportionately where students of color or students with disabilities were having higher rates of removals than other students or their peers. And we began to see it being used for nonviolent kinds of situations where it really wasn't around school safety anymore. It was really around situations of disrespect and defiance, disruptive behavior, and minor forms of verbal and physical aggression. Because I think what took hold was, if students misbehave, we need to punish them to stop them from doing that. And when we began to sit back and look at data, we began to see that it wasn't working, that that's not how we teach, that we really weren't telling students or showing students what we wanted them to do instead, and we weren't really providing the supports they needed to stay within their school environment. The other piece that happens was suspensions. When we remove students, not only does it affect the students by weakening their relationship with their teachers, with their peers, with the school, so they feel like less connected to schools, they're less engaged academically, so they don't do as well. It also begins to become a contributor at the very early age of students really forming visions of school as places that are not safe for them in terms of feeling welcome and feeling supported. It also begins to create situations where there's a higher risk that they will drop out, that there's a higher risk that they will become engaged in poor outcomes like delinquency and other pieces. So I think that suspensions we're looking at, when we remove them from classroom instruction, it has far-reaching consequences for most students. There's been a number of studies that have come out, and we are beginning to see relationships between suspensions and excluding students from classroom instruction, between rates of dropout, between chronic absenteeism, and we've also seen that as schools reduce the use of exclusionary discipline, that we see reduced issues around chronic absenteeism, we see lower rates of dropout, we see higher academic performance by students. So I think that there's we're beginning to see real data that shows that we need to rethink how we are managing our school environments. The other thing that we see is
Hold on one second, we have a question. Mr. Doran.
In terms of this, I didn't see it in the report, and so it might be coming. One of the issues I know that came up at a community meeting was parents talking about the reentry of their students, and we've talked about that on several occasions. Will as you further go on with this, will it help to address some of the reentry, which is exactly what you're talking about here on this slide? But where are we on reentry conversation?
I actually think that's a really important piece. I don't know that the report has addressed that. It's just laid the groundwork of things to think about and what to do. But I do believe that there are certain strategies that are emerging and certain strategies that need to be in place to feel that students are re-engaged. And one of the entry points is, as students return from an exclusion, that we begin to start planning, not in telling students this is what you have to do, and if you make a mistake you'll be excluded again, that we begin to look for the root cause of the problems. We begin to think about ways of supporting that student and preventing from situations where that may reoccur. So I think that there has been attention to it. There are things that we can do to structure those meetings, but I think it's not something that I think we have really talked about with the district about providing supports around that.
Okay, so that's something we might want to add to the previous recommendations on the previous slide to really look at that piece.
Or Dr. Ford's
again, part of the rewrite, that's actually directly tied to SMART being required and not recommended, because we've made the shift in SMART to what that program looks like, and actually have added a counselor down there, and have greatly expanded the counseling piece that we've done there. And this is after some research with how the Anchorage schools are handling their, and of course that was in tandem with this, how Anchorage schools are handling their students who are on long-term suspension or exclusion. And so the counseling piece of that we have really worked to enhance. But that needs to be something that all students experience, not just, so thus the recommendation that SMART very soon become required and not recommended. So in terms of short-term suspensions, again, depending on where we land, many of those should probably no longer happen. If there are some that do happen, then we have to be very realistic about the supports in schools to do that, because we have academic counselors. But again, if we talk about beefing up prevention intervention specialists and social workers and other types of supports to, really work on reentry with kids, because right now, it's not that there's not a desire to do that, there's just not the capacity to do that, to really have
there is no desire, but it's the capacity that's...
Did I say that backwards?
Yeah, I think so, right.
I said it's not that there's not a desire, there's just not capacity.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad that's in the conversation, especially the short-term ones. Thank you.
Ms. Moratti.
Back to the expanding the counseling in the SMART program, is that like admin or academic type counseling, or is that social and emotional counseling?
They're doing a lot of social emotional work in that program. Yeah, and we started to shift that last spring. Mr. Rice?
Just one thing that, you were bringing up the counseling and, the social workers in the schools as well too. We are already facing the budget crisis, but, one thing that we need to look at is how much this is going to be, costing as well too. I want to do everything I can for kids. If I had a magic wand and I can do it, I would do it. But, would you be able to come up, whenever you bring this to us, when you come back to this later on and say, here's about what it might be able to cost?
Right. There'll probably be sort of a spectrum of changes, and, here's some recommended changes to implement it with fidelity. We need this, where can we land? I think one thing that we're looking at short term that I would include in this year's proposed budget is a prevention intervention specialist type position, if not exactly that, in every single school, K-12, so that they can provide this level of support to kids in schools. So we have them, and we can get into that a little bit later. We have them in some schools, but not all schools. So
and just another one. Sorry I'm late. Work went on a little bit longer. We're trying to clear the roads. But I read somewhere that, doing that intervention and trying to, because we talked about this before in the past, about these repeat offenders. And I've always asked, how do we reach these kids and how do we keep them from coming back and seeing us? Because I know, there's a few kids that, I've seen, and I'm glad I've seen them, crossing the threshold and getting their diploma, but how do we get them, when they're younger and get them on the right track? And I think that's why we're here, and what we're doing, but, that... So maybe you guys will be touching on that, and like I said, I'm sorry I'm late. And
no, I think that's future work to be done, and that's one of the things. A teacher in the classroom can only do so much. You need other people to do that kind of work with kids. So we've been getting at it in different ways, and I think creating something that's systemic across schools.
But we've had the prevention intervention specialists in place, and we cut them 2 years
and then
ago.
every time we get hit with budget cuts, right, we coalesce around class size, which completely makes sense, but then you lose your supports.
That's right. And we've got to concentrate on that this year. We really do. How are we going to get our numbers up for enrollment if we don't ever start taking care of our schools? So I think we've got to find if there's a will, there's a way. So Yes, Mr. Rice.
So, yeah, I just, here in other states are, starting to do this and starting to mandate that stuff, one thing that we really need to be able to push is, unfunded mandates, that if this is something that they want, that it's going to be above and beyond of, what we do as an education system, and that, we need to be able to bring these, specialists in to be able to help us, with some of these issues.
Else?
So can we go to the next slide? Thank you. I just wanted to talk briefly that one of the things that we know is that not only is it costly when we suspend students or student kinds of behaviors and disruptions in the classroom, that it really is one of the major reasons why teachers tend to leave their position or leave the profession, that we're seeing a shortage of teachers, and we see this as a contributing factor. So that's another kind of cost that we know if we begin to do some prevention work at the systemic level, that it will have some benefits and teacher retention as well. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? I want to talk a little bit, and then go to the next slide, a little bit about what we saw in some of your board policies and practices, and I know we're getting short of time. So what we saw that you have this very strong and wonderful emphasis on equity, on learning and prevention, and I think that that is a core that is really, really be starting to really define the kinds of services and kinds of partnerships that you are building with your school communities, with your parents, and with your students. And so I think that one of the things that we did when we looked through the policies, and I think policy drives, when I was a practitioner, I used to always think that policies, that's what the state people did. But now that I have been working more at the systemic level, I do know that policies drive how we think about and how we approach the practices that we do. And I think that that becomes something that we began to look at when we looked at the policies that you have, and that we believe that in your handbook, the student rights and responsibilities, that really is how the school board policies, which are there, are being interpreted and being put into place for administrators, for parents, and for teachers and families. And so it's that handbook that really is, that tells people this is what we value and this is how we're going to go about it. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Doran.
Sorry, quick question. Is that your read, and I guess answers these questions about the handbook, but the previous slide, it says it provides guidance to school administrators. Is the handbook for parents and students, or is it for school administrators? Is that your read on it?
That's a really good question, and I think that I'm going to turn the question back around to you folks, because I think that it depends on, it really makes a difference on how you're going to really think about the handbook. Is it for administrators? Is it for administrators and students and families? Quite frankly, we got different answers, and so I think it's for all three, and if it is, then there has to be some thinking about what are we communicating, not in just the words and the information, but how are we communicating in terms of the style and the types of language and the way that we are presenting it out to the community. So I think that that makes a difference on who's going to read it and who do we expect to use it.
Okay, and so that's one of the questions that should be in the next slide, is about it, who's it for and how's it. Thank you.
So yes, and who is it for, but what are you expecting it to do? Is it supposed to be just communicating about board policies to the stakeholders that are involved? Is it to really kind of lay the groundwork and say safe and welcoming school communities are our priority? Is it really there to also tell people and reinforce the values and mission of the district? Or is it supposed to be used to guide school discipline decision making? So I think it could be one of those, it could be all four of those, it could be more than that. So I think part of it, really beginning to rethink how you're going to revise the student rights and responsibilities. What do you expect it to do, and who do you expect it to communicate to? So I think that's one of the fundamental questions. As we begin to support other districts, that's one of the things that they are wrestling with. And most see the handbook as the first tool that they use to communicate to families and children and students about their district and what they value and how they accept the expectations. So can you go to the next slide, please? And in your handbook, you have laid out very clearly what the positive expectations are for everybody within the school community, and I think that really is what we believe is best practice. And it certainly is done in a way that is saying this is what we expect in very positive terms and in welcoming terms. Can you go to the next slide, please? One of the things that we would encourage you to rethink is the whole notion of progressive discipline. When it was first introduced as a way of revising policies, the notion was that we should be assigning consequences that are proportional to what the student did. And also we should not only are they punitive consequences, but the types of supports that we have, so that it really is looking at a differentiated, multi-tiered system of support. That's where that notion came from. And I think for some folks, what that shifted to was progressive discipline means that if something didn't work, like a suspension didn't work the first time, the next time we need to make it stronger and longer. And what we began to learn is that maybe for some students, a suspension really is not going to teach them, is not going to be helpful in engaging them in school, it's not going to get you to the outcome that you want. And what we know about high suspension schools are schools that tend to rely more on suspension or excluding students. They have actually more behavioral issues, and they actually have lower academic outcomes. That as schools begin to turn to using more prevention and emphasizing early intervention strategies and proactive ways of teaching, they tend to have higher academic outcomes because they set the norms in the community for people to get along. Students and families and teachers understand how they're going to talk to each other in respectful ways, how they're going to resolve conflicts, how they're going to really do all of those pieces around social emotional learning. So it's not just routines, but how you turn in homework and how you do those pieces. It's also, this is how we treat each other within our school community. So it's shifting away from a more punitive way of thinking about relationships to one that we are really encouraging and engaging in stronger relationships, and that's the goal. So I think that is one thing to think about when you think about progressive discipline, is really looking at incremental, both positive and teaching kinds of consequences, rather than just relying on a punitive consequence to change somebody's behavior, because that often and very frequently is not the solution to the problem. Can we go to the next slide? I'm going to just talk about this and then I'm going to stop. Okay. One of the things that is very laid out in the handbook is really if-then statements. If a student does this type of response, then this is what should happen. And I think it's sometimes been a little bit unclear to people whether that is at the discretion of the administrator or it's something that they should do each time. And so one of the things that some districts are doing, moving towards, is not so much consistency in the same kinds of consequence to a student, but a consistency in the decision-making process of how to determine what should happen that will teach a student to and prevent the discipline incident from reoccurring. So I think so rethinking about what does consistency really mean? Does it mean that we do the same thing for everybody? Or do we have a decision-making process where we are really having the same goals, but we may be individualizing what we're doing in response to the situation, the student's needs, and the types of learning that the student needs to do to really become, to learn more socially acceptable ways to handle difficulties that they've been handling. Does that make sense? So I'm going to stop here and invite questions.
Okay. I see that as a, hold on 1 minute. Sharon, try and call Allison back. I'm sorry. She wasn't able to get a good reception, so she wanted us to take a break and get her back in. I don't know if I should continue now. Let me just wait.
As you're waiting, what we did was we brought example handbooks from other districts that have begun this process. It's usually more than one process, just for you to look at different ways that other districts have thought about. And it feels like ironic that we have brought some handbooks from New York City to Alaska because those communities are so different. But I think we brought the ones that tend to give a wide range of examples and tend to be a little farther along than other districts.
So these are like their student handbooks that they hand out?
This is like the student parent handbooks that they hand out, and so, or their code of conduct. So I think that it just, different districts are approaching it differently, but they tend to really think about it as a tiered system.
I hope we don't get school police around here.
Ms. Kress.
I just wanted, because I couldn't remember, Vicki and Trevor, in the next few pages on the slides, the samples that we have there of the levels of intervention with the disciplinary process from that other school district. What district was that? I don't remember. I don't think that was the New York one, but I know the project team thought that was a good example. So
I think the examples that the handbooks that they really liked were from Baltimore and then the New York City.
My home? I know what I was talking about.
So the city schools references the Baltimore one. I know the last one is Maryland, so I'm assuming.
I'm sorry, I missed your question.
It's referenced as city schools. Is that a Baltimore one or on the next slide? I think it's the next slide.
No, I would have to look.
Okay, I know the last one is Maryland, so. That's a question. One, I'm really glad on this one that you were mentioning about consistency and decision-making, focus on the goals, and then individualize from there versus the consequences for us to think about and work with. But I also, it's crossed my mind, when you've been up doing, have you done school site visits? Walk through the schools, spend some time?
I have not. And I think most of the work that's been done directly has been to gather focus groups.
Okay, because it strikes me as, and I'm just reflecting on some of my visits to the schools, how impressed I've been. I love to be there when there's passing times and stand in the hallway, and it's been really impressive watching students, high school, middle school, grade school. But I think particularly at the middle and high school, because you have a lot of big bodies moving. But the number and just the observation, I think is important when we look at these other numbers. But the feel of that in the hallways, the positive interactions, kids chatting as they're moving, actually a nice positive energy, good feel going through, staff calling students by name, interfacing by name. I mean, those types of things that I think needs to be part of our database. Again, it's snapshots, but when I look at the data pieces, quite frankly, those data pieces are pretty negative. And so trying to put those into the totality of what's going on, I think is really important, not to play down the problem areas and the concerns, but I was wondering if you had observations that go along with the data only informs, but you really see the things that are going on. And I think what I see teachers doing in classrooms, and a number of people see those things going on, how teachers deal with trying to make those real positive situations or dealing with those issues. But anyway, good climate in action.
Everyone else?
Mrs. Lambert?
No, I don't have any questions right now.
Good.
Thank you.
You're much clearer now, too.
That's good.
I just wanted to make a comment, and no one take this personally, because I know we got some principals in the audience. But when you put it to principals' discretion, how does that play across the nation? because I know at times here I've seen situations where, I'll just use one example. If a principal knows the family of the kid or whatever, the discretion would be slightly different than a student that the principal may not know. Nothing to you, Mr. Dorn, but I'm just using an example, okay? I think that would probably bring in, I'm not saying it's wrong to do it that way, but I'm saying that across the board, there has to be a way that we're doing it the same, just to make it fair for all students. Did you see that across the nation, if they handled any situations differently because of that?
There are certain situations I think that you have to have established procedures because they really do involve safety. Manufacturing and distributing drugs and alcohol is one area, weapons is one area, but I think one of the concern that's coming to mind that we're beginning to see people rethink the school discipline policies and approaches is that we're overusing exclusionary discipline, and it's really creating environments. It's really kind of counterproductive in the long run, and it may have immediately give some relief to the situation, but in the long run it creates a bigger problem. I think some of the research that's coming out around principal leadership is now emerging, and it is of interest because it's amazing how powerful the leader's orientation and belief system and how they carry out their work really makes a difference, and just setting the tone for the entire school and building. I think that one of the things that districts are engaging with this, and I work with a group of districts in Oregon and Washington around this issue, and one of the things that we really talk about is how do we get to a shared understanding and agreement about the approach. And I think that some people are coming from more of a zero tolerance type of orientation. Other people are really looking at a more prevention and supportive and individualized approach. And so one of the things to think about is how do you get people on the same page to think about how they're going to approach this problem. Within Oregon, one of the things that they did, and we actually looking to see how effective that was they established a policy saying that as you begin to look at assigning disciplinary consequences, you really need to consider several factors: the situation of the event, the behavioral history of the child, the teaching needs of the individual, and the circumstances. So I think that it wasn't just if you only look at the behavioral infraction and decide what to do, that you really look at the totality of the circumstances. And some of it, I think, we have to accept is that we can prevent some of these behaviors from happening by changing the routines or changing the interactions of the adults to the students. And so beginning to think about where is it that we are needing to really make some differences. And some of it has to do with really beginning to target professional learning experiences for teachers who may have who come from varied backgrounds in terms of their instructional practices and their behavioral classroom management practices, that we may have to begin to update what we know and learn, and understand that every year as your school students change, that there might be new challenges that we have to really begin to address and support teachers. Mental health counseling and support is something that is proven to be effective at all levels, from preschool all the way up to high school. So beginning to really think about that level of support. But part of it is, do you have a shared approach and philosophy towards school discipline, and is it the same across schools, or fairly consistent across schools? And I think that would be a question that this district may want to ask themselves in terms of moving forward and deciding what to do around leadership and administrative.
I want to have a quick addition. In the focus group with administrators, they shared about the differences in classrooms referrals from teacher to teacher. So there were some teachers that sent a lot of referrals that resulted in suspension, and some sent none. And particularly for someone like myself who worked with beginning teachers and teacher mentoring, what is it that the teachers who are referring no one are doing, and how do we transfer that knowledge, particularly for new teachers? When we see, as Vicki shared, that's one of the large reasons for teachers leaving. The other thing that I found fascinating in the focus group with the administrators was that there's similarity of consequences, meaning they looked to this and they saw a number and they assigned suspensions based on these numbers. So while it says or principal's discretion, there was what was expressed during those focus groups is that they did not use their discretion. They simply saw 10 days, that's what I'm supposed to do, and they assigned 10 days, regardless of potentially using their discretions. And again, to this earlier, regardless of what other intervention steps had been taken or not taken.
Is there a way for, when you stated that some teachers would send their students to the office more than others, some wouldn't send them at all, is there a way to talk with the, let's say a principal at a school had that situation, which they probably all have it, and the teachers that are not sending their kids to the office, couldn't that style of teaching or discipline be carried over to the one that's sending them there all the time? I mean, it's kind of like train the trainer type of thing. Did you see that anywhere across the nation, that it was suggested to talk to the ones that's not sending them to the office as much?
Let me answer it a little bit differently.
Okay.
There are three, and people are starting to look at this because they see such potential. If we begin to really begin to have a discipline system that will create a welcoming environment and keep kids in school, that we will really begin to reach our academic goals for each and every student. And we'll begin to really close those discipline gaps. What we see is a lot of disproportionality among student groups. The three things that we know that are emerging that have really proven to be effective and begin to close that gap. One is My Teaching Partner, which is an intervention. It's a professional learning and coaching intervention for teachers that's very targeted. The second is a kind of team-based approach to situations that where a student may be doing a high-risk type of behavior, and so it becomes a team-based case management approach to begin to look at, and it's out of Dewey Cornell, but also we have a student threat assessment process that's out of Oregon as well, where they're really beginning to look at how do we build and wrap around services within the school or within the school community or the larger kind of network of juvenile justice and mental health around students that need those intensive supports, and we're seeing that to have benefits. The third is an emerging practice which is being labeled as empathetic discipline, where we're beginning to administer it not in a punitive way, but beginning to think about using discipline as a means of teaching and supporting students, and carefully thinking about how do we make corrective responses where that will teach, and how do we begin to intensify supports and rewards. When I consult around students, when I've done that in the past, my first question is, how would the students' life be different if they follow the rules like you want them to be? And if it won't be any different, or they would get less attention, I think that speaks to some of the interventions that need to be put into place.
Like the old saying goes, sometimes you got to give a carrot instead of a stick.
Yep.
Mr. Dorn?
Okay, yes, I can't keep quiet. But, and I won't belabor it, but I do think that principal discretion becomes an extremely important part of this, because it is knowing those things and principals knowing that about their kids, knowing that about their staff. And I think, if you're getting a lot of referrals from a classroom, I think principals are really quite good. And I think some of the things we've tried to put in with the Danielson framework of talking about teaching, et cetera, is not as the evaluative framework, but as an instructional piece. It's working. Why are these referrals coming? And I've watched principals on all levels do that. And so it is really important that discretion is there. I was very glad when you talked about the consistency of the decision-making process and the goals. And the bottom line comes down to, is it fair? And I think parents and teachers know that. Now, sometimes they'll challenge that. And we have to step back and we have to say, yes, am I being fair? Or did I overreact or underreact, or those types of things, and we do that a lot. But I do think it needs to be a piece of how we establish that culture, and will become very important as we look at the overall discipline. piece, especially as we want to
I think
provide positive things.
the historical perspective here is important too. So going back only 5 years, the board was very concerned with the discrepancies between schools, and so when a student finally did get to the school board level, they'd see one school using all kinds of principal discretion and another not. And then, if you have time later, dig into the dashboard that Ellis sent, because there's also very distinct discrepancies at the rate that different student populations receive discipline in our district, and that's stark. That's like a stark reality. So the board at the time was very interested in trying to level that out and address some of those things. So again, I think this next evolution of how do we meet the needs of kids, but how do we also address the disparities among student groups in terms of who's receiving discipline and who's not in our schools. So that's an ongoing challenge.
Mr. Rice?
So I have a question. You're explaining to us about, what to do for procedural issues. Do you have any suggestions for us to be able to bring kids back into school? How to look at that and how to be able to, go, okay, well, this kid did A, B, C, and D. This kid did, this. How do we, differentiate all the different students that we have to bring back into the schools, or uphold what administrators have done, during our school board executive sessions? And would that be an appropriate question here?
Well, I'll let you answer. I think we're going to have to answer that ourselves, but I'm sure there are recommendations around these things.
We have recommendations, and we would, I always have an opinion, so if you ask me my opinion, I can always give it to you. But I also have long years of experience in bringing very difficult students with very difficult and challenging behaviors back into schools, and there is a process. And I think the decision has to be made. Do you want to put some time and energy in the prevention part of the process, or the teachers, some students are going to demand attention no matter what, and resources, so do you put it at the beginning of the process? But there is an approach to it where the intent is to build supervision and supports for the students to prevent the behavior, and there really is a process for beginning to identify what those are, and we would encourage that to happen. And it really begins to thinking about how to engage parents more purposely, and I think in some situations that's more difficult than others and challenging, but if that becomes more the routine for re-engaging students, I think it becomes more helpful. There's a lot of things that go with thinking about that, and it just depends on the types of behaviors the students might bring in, because you're not just dealing, when you're re-engaging students, you are helping the students, but you also need to build some supports around staff members who may have been involved, and also build some supports so that whatever difficulties may have happened, that you begin to resolve some of the feelings around that as well. So there are some procedures that should be in place, and many times it requires an additional support person to come, especially in the more difficult situations. It's better to have somebody who's more third party to come in and help with that. What we find is students who are involved in multiple issues are more complicated, and that means that the school has to have a more coherent approach across the administrators, across the school counselors, and the teachers, so that everybody really is approaching and communicating with the parents and the students in the same way. But sometimes that's more difficult to do when we get really, really busy. So building that into your systemic approach of building those communication systems, building a shared approach of how you're going to address it, and really beginning to look at multi-tiered systems of support, so you're saving those most precious resources for the students who have the most intensive needs.
Mr. Rice, because you came late, Dr. Gaborg has it in her memo of the things that we have recommendations on that we're going to be working on. You got a packet, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can go back on those, and you may have more that you want to offer or give to her as well. But I also wanted to make a statement, I'm getting to you next, Mr. Dorn, is one of the things that I found with raising my kids up here in Alaska in a small community, My youngest, I shouldn't have said youngest because that way y'all know who he is, but anyway, he was my hardest one going through school. The kid was very bright, totally intelligent. He put the kindergarten teacher in tears, and I won't tell you who it was. She's retired now. But what we found out through that experience was when you allowed him to do things to entertain the class, he was the greatest kid you ever wanted to work with because he would get his work done quicker. And I think a lot of teachers are finding, what is that niche with that young kid that we can work with and keep him there? I think looping will help also. A lot of kids that loop from one grade to another, that teacher already knows what the good, the different, and the things that this kid will do and won't do. So that next year they can start working in on that instead of starting the first year off with a new teacher trying to learn what's going on with this child. So I think we work on those issues and try to get those things working as well. I think we can get to it before they get to high school or junior high school.
And I think you have to be really aware that as you move forward with your systemic shifts and your cultural shifts, that there needs to be resources and supports to the staff members and teachers and administrators in your buildings to really make that happen. That just telling them to stop doing something is really not helpful. It's really, let's do this instead. So, and then beginning to build supports around that.
So maybe I could walk through, we can go back to the memo now that you have a sort of a foundation. Oh, I'm sorry, was there a question?
This may be a quick answer because you may or may not have any information on it, or maybe be able to get some first. Again, national perspective, you mentioned earlier just a quick passing comment about threat assessment. We sometimes require those. I'm interested in what you're seeing nationally. We don't get those results. We just, whether it happened or not, and something like this. What you're seeing on those assessments and what the requirements are for returning to school. And the other one is we use the term indefinite expulsion, which is indefinite, and if you're seeing that in any other places in the country and how that's playing out, if you have any information.
I would say that for threat assessment, that it's really, threat assessments are really good forensic assessments and interviews, but really when I talk about that, I'm talking about the process. There is, that assessment is part of that process, but then what's the process of beginning to build supports? And then before that, what's the process of early identification of a student who may have difficulty in that area? So I think that the Dewey Cornell out of University of Virginia has a threat assessment process. And then John Van Driel in Oregon has a threat assessment process that probably engages the community more as well as the school-based team. So those are the two models that I would look to. In terms of indefinite suspension, I don't know that I've heard that, but I certainly don't know every policy that's out there.
Thank you.
So I thought I'd just walk back through the activities that we've, as we worked through this, the recommendations on, so it's right at the front of your packet again. Some short-term things that we're going to work on is, again, create a consistent position across the elementary, middle, and high school to address behavior, substance abuse prevention, and intervention. And so this would likely be very similar to, if not, the prevention intervention specialist position. And this would be in place of the behavior intervention aides. We already have these guys in place in some of the secondary schools, and also in place of the, I think we have half of one ISI person we figured out left. So this would be a consistent systemic position that I would include in the my budget proposal that would start to get at this consistent level of prevention support at the schools. And then we've heard feedback, actually very timely feedback. It was interesting hearing that testimony when it came in about the dress code. And I can tell you this is a perfect example of there being the full spectrum of perspective on dress code by secondary administrators. So you have those who see the need for drastic changes, and you have the full spectrum on this. So one thing we're going to do to provide some parameters around that is we're going to make sure it's Title IX compliant, which will help, I think, move us forward. But we'll finish that process with the administrators and update that soon. So, and then you heard about the Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. So this would be any model or, the bits and pieces of all these samples that we've received. I think we'll start shifting in that direction. when I heard the feedback around our handbook, and I just thought about how many times as a teacher, some of the very first interactions I had with kids was this handbook and what ours looks like. So that really just spoke to me, and I thought that is so interesting. So anything we can do to change this handbook to be a welcoming document and not a punitive document, which is how it currently reads, would be wonderful. So that'll take a little bit of time. We'll just slowly work on pieces of that. And there's not a ton that we're doing in hard copy anymore anyway. There's so much possibilities with, what we have online. So anyway, those are short-term things I think we can work on. Something else I would like to do is starting in January, and I believe Mrs. Stewart is very ready to do this, and I think actually might be experimenting with some things already, but using a pilot approach to student tobacco, alcohol, and drug incidents that eliminates out-of-school suspension. Again, we all know we're seeing incidents, these types of infractions younger and younger into elementary school even. And so instead of suspending kids, they currently have a prevention intervention specialist, and so look at the policies differently and use a setting in school with a prevention intervention specialist to address these behaviors. So I'd like to have Ms. Kraska and Ms. Stewart work on a pilot that then we could kind of report out to the board and say how that's going. So also work, like that would be a set of policies that I think you don't want to get too far ahead of the entire scope of the discipline chapter, but I think our drug, alcohol, and tobacco policies need an update fairly quickly. So that would be something that we could attempt to get done this spring and bring to the board for to consider in late spring, and maybe we could start it doing something a little bit different in fall. That would be contingent probably on the prevention intervention specialist positions being in place so that we actually have the support we need to help those students if we, instead of suspending them every single time, if we're going to support them in the building. Another thing I'd like to recommend that we do right away is make SMART a requirement rather than an option. I shouldn't say right away, starting in fall, so we can let folks know and also make sure we have what we need to make that happen. That was something, if I understand, the team thought was fascinating that it wasn't a requirement, because again, those are your most at-risk students, and we have well over 50% who do not attend that program, so they're not getting any supports from us. And I think we're trying to improve. We're working very hard to improve again, the efficacy of that program, and we could do a lot for kids if we could have them actually there. So we can, and actually our group already is using bus fare and taxi fare and all kinds of things to help kids who are in, whose parents may not be able to drive them, help them get there. And then the last thing would be then in the fall, so take this on in the fall, put together a discipline task force with, again, a variety of stakeholders, but it would be I imagine a single work group with maybe a couple sub-strands, and really get after next fall, updating our discipline system, going through all this data and really taking a crack at that. And then if we could begin to roll that out next spring to the board for implementation, full implementation the following year. So if there's budget implications, the time at which those policies roll would also be the time at which the next fiscal year's budget would be being built, and we could make those decisions at the same time. So that's my thought around these things.
Well, one question I would like to ask on the school you selected. Don't mean to put anyone on the spot once again, but was there a deliberation or more students at that particular school is the reason why you selected that for a pilot? And my opinion would be which school we have the most coming from would be where I would like to see a pilot done at.
I think it's currently it's the philosophy of that current administration wanting to support kids and not move them out of school, and also the number of incidents that they're seeing in this particular area. So they are as interested in being a part of this as I am as interested in a pilot.
Okay. One other thing, I just want to follow up with this one other thing. The intervention specialist, I go back to where you were talking about teachers not wanting to stay. A part of it is because they don't know from year to year if they're going to have a job. I mean, we had a very good group of intervention prevention specialists, and we have to find a way to hold on to our good, experienced people. The students know them. They know the students. The kid will have a better chance of staying in school if they're working with somebody that they know. And we just have to stop this yo-yo effect. And I understand it's dollars, but we have to find a way. If we're trying to bring more kids back to our schools, we have to find a way to keep our people and stop having them, oh, I won't be able to pay my mortgage payment next year because I won't have a job. So
to that point, actually, that's one of our long-time outstanding prevention and intervention specialists is at Ryan as well. So I think he's very interested in and already part of trying to do something different for kids. I'll let Sean talk now.
Okay, good.
I was just going to add to what Karen said. One of our long-standing prevention and intervention specialists who's been at several schools and is now at Ryan, she actually pitched the idea before we even kind of solidified this. She said, my students who are being suspended, our students in this school who are being, in every school, but in this school specifically, who are being suspended under the drug alcohol policy, first and second offense, they're more at risk when I'm not keeping them in school. And she said, they're still in a disciplined status, but she said, I can do more social emotional work with them when they're in front of me in my room than I can if they're at home, maybe unsupervised completely. You know, that's not for every student, but she said, I'm more concerned about them when they're not here than when they are. She says, I can do a whole curriculum of work with them as long as I have them with me. Kind of like teachers say, we can teach them and they can learn as long as they're in the room. So I thought it was a brilliant idea, and I shared it with Dr. Gaborik, and part of the recommendations was looking for a place to pilot. It was a natural fit, and they already are doing many things within their school in general, not just with Ms. Peak, to try and keep the kids in the building when they are in a disciplined status. So it's this balance that we're trying to follow our rights and responsibilities, do the right thing and be consistent, but also look at the social and emotional needs of these kids.
Okay. Hold on one second, Mr. Dorn. Ms. Anderson.
So I had a question for you. Out of all your research, were there any student peer groups that dealt with or helped to create a better atmosphere when infractions and things were done? Like peer mediation in dealing with some of these situations.
I can't speak to research, but what we know is that students are engaged in this process. They really are. They really tell us what we should be doing, and it's really important. When I've done positive behavior interventions and support networks, especially at the high school level, I really think it was very much a plus to have students on that school climate team, and that just meant, but what it meant was support to the administrative team to shift some of their thinking around who makes what decisions. Also having parent engagement in that process, or parent and student voice, and you can do that in a number of ways. You can have them part of the committee, which sometimes doesn't meet their needs in terms of scheduling or in terms of the kind of culture that committees are create. You can get student voice by doing reflection groups or going out and asking parents what they think and what they would recommend. They truly will tell you what the cultural issues are in their school. They can tell you, they may not tell you what the reasons why things are happening, but they will have suggestions about what could make it better, and I think that they are an important part of that community and that fabric. So we right now, through one of our contracts, the Regional Educational Laboratory contracts, are working on a set of materials to really help schools begin this process of policy revision and beginning to really collect some of that information to help them make and revise some of their school discipline policies. And then right now it's going through that review process to be, and will at some point be publicly available for your use.
Mr. Dorn? I'm sorry, were you finished? Okay. Mr. Dorn.
A couple of quick observations. On that pilot, I think it's a wonderful example of principal discretion, which is allowed within our current policy, but it's really looking at students. I'm glad the handbook is going to be redone. I had an interesting afternoon rereading it, and the redundancy and the dress code was very interesting. Revisiting that after a few years. Question on the SMART, and if it becomes required, does that also help us enrollment-wise? Because if a student is indefinitely excluded, doesn't go to a school program, they're actually withdrawn, I would assume.
Depends on the amount of time.
Right.
What's that piece there?
Yeah, so I mean, typically,
because it's our, it's based on our October count, so
right.
the timing and the amount of time sort of.
Right, yeah, but I'm thinking in terms of our overall attendance rate.
Oh, for sure that.
And as well as enrollment, but attendance rate when we calculate those things out, because if they're indefinitely, so anyway, I'm assuming they're withdrawn if they're not in a district
Correct.
program.
If they don't attend anything. Yeah.
And then relative to all these, I like the listening recommendations here, but just a suggestion that I think we keep in mind for the board that we should plan on a couple of work sessions before it comes to us as a board, I think, because to add to the understanding the background of these things would be very important, rather than try to do it in the context of a meeting with 4 other agenda items or more.
Even sort of find maybe the natural sections of things, drug alcohol policy, and kind of find these natural groupings.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Can I last one, and then I'll keep. It's just a caution, because I've watched it over the years, that we be careful about sort of judging schools on the number of discipline actions. Sometimes it has come up that, well, if the school has so many suspensions or such, then things are really going wrong. And if they don't have enough, that has also come up and said, oh, well, they're too easy, and without really going into, I think we need to be careful about drawing conclusions, especially as we move forward and try to move ahead on working with students on a long-term teachable moment.
Ms. Anderson.
I was just going to say thank you for your report, because it's really in-depth, and it really has a lot for us to reference and to do, just to consider, and it's timely because we have to change over the years. This district has spent a great deal of money training and doing diversity training and, tolerance and different things like that. So it's not that we haven't had the training, but it's just time to shift. If I'm listening to the presentation correctly tonight, I hear sort of community, I hear a shift in thinking, shift in policy, and a support underneath the new dynamics of what the policy is going to look like. And, I would have to piggyback on Ms. Kraska saying about her support professional, because I have 35 years in the district, and every time a student got suspended outside of my room or class or whatever, I always tried to advocate to have that student not spend those additional days outside, because you see the disparity, you see the catch-up, you see all the frustration with staff, and then if I have a certain connection with that student, I can come at that student and support that student in a totally different way. And I think that's kind of a missing point. We have its spots throughout our district, but it's a very weighty dynamic that goes into this. So I'm glad to hear that said tonight.
I just wanted to add to that, because I know others probably have comments, but these packets that you gave us from the different schools, is there any way we can get every one of them? Really, because I know there's different things in each one of them, and I would like to at least get an email. You don't have to do copies for me of all of them. I can make my own copies.
I actually sent most of them into a Dropbox for you to pull out. Yeah, these are public. Don't reinvent the wheel. And what's funny, every district kind of chooses and resonates to a different example.
Right.
And it just depends on your culture and what's going to build on strengths within your district. So.
Exactly. Yeah, okay. I'd like to get a copy of them. I don't know if other board members want them, but I do.
I'll just send the information to Sharon.
Okay, wonderful. That'd be wonderful. Any other comments? How about you, Miss Allison? Miss Lambert?
No, I just want to thank everybody for their hard work on this. I think there does need to be some pretty significant changes, especially in the non-safety related types of offenses. constantly say how we need to have student contact, and the more student contact is, better for the kids and increased graduation rates and better student achievement. But then we kicked them out for pretty much nothing, and it really hurts the kids, and I think it hurts, it hurts the parents and it hurts the community on what the long-lasting effects are, which they said tonight. There's some long-lasting effects. We're just out for pretty much nothing. So I think this is a great first step, and I want to see where it goes.
Okay. My last comment is I really appreciate you guys coming to this area. Hope it wasn't too much snow. I don't think it was too much bad weather for Bernie when she came those times, and I really wish I was able to attend the meetings. And I would just like to suggest that when you have your task force and the other things that we're getting ready to do, the other meetings, it really needs to be in the evening time because people can't take off a lot, and we want community input in these things. And the more community input that we have, there's different situations, there's different circumstances out there for everyone. But if you have an evening meeting, and I say 5:30 or 6, I think we could come up with more ideas and be able to implement more things with more people at the table. Anything else? Anyone? Okay, I guess I'll call for an adjournment. I know. Oh, that's right. We got one more thing to do. I'm sorry. Well, we can close this one out, though. Sorry, Jerry. I forgot you were sitting there. I couldn't see you for Tim's head, okay? Okay, we'll take a, yes, it was your fault, Tim. We'll take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come on back and approve the application for watershed. Okay, we'll bring this meeting back to order. And now we'll have the renewal charter school application for Watershed Charter School. Dr. Gabork, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I think Watershed's up for its 10-year renewal, so there's a process that they need to go through with that, and one of the steps is a work session with the board, so the board has an opportunity to, so Watershed has an opportunity to present kind of where they're headed and what they're thinking, and the board has a chance to really ask questions, and then the board will take action later this spring, kind of in the more normal time frame that we look at charter schools. So if there's anything, if there are questions that the board needs answers to that they're not able to provide at the moment, we can get those to board members. And if we need sometimes we've had charters come back. Typically that's more for new charters, but for continuing charters, if there's just anything that the board needs in terms of being prepared for the final renewal and recommendation for Watershed. We just want to be sure that we kind of air all that out tonight and give them a chance to respond to us, to respond to the board in a timely manner so that then you can take your action in the spring. So turn it over to Jared.
Imagine the green lights go. All right, thank you everybody. I'm here with Jason Gillum. He is our Academic Policy Committee Chair, and so he'll be talking a little bit about changes in bylaws that we've had, and some, and with that, some changes in our Academic Policy Committee. But before I go on, because I didn't really know how many people, and Ms. Tuttle told me to keep the number of people we brought to the table limited, so I just invited him as chair, but I want to acknowledge that we have some other board members, including staff members, in the audience. And so, all right, we have Kelly Mansfield, who's been on the APC for 2 terms, Abigail Paul, who's a founding member of Watershed and has been around forever, before Watershed was even Watershed. She was here 10 years ago. When we were, just a dream. And then Amy Arneson, I'm turning around, I know who's back there. And Amy Arneson so Abigail Paul is also our special education teacher. Amy Arneson is one of our 3rd, 4th grade teachers and is on the APC and has been at Watershed since our 2nd year of existence. She was actually my student teacher way back then. So I want to thank them for coming. and I knew I was going to forget Moira. And Moira O'Malley is one of our first and second grade teachers. She's also on the APC and has been teaching at Watershed since I poached her from Weller Elementary. So I just want to acknowledge their presence.
Make one more announcement about who won the $25,000.
That's right. We had one of our students was one of, I
the
forget.
PFD, you guys, okay?
Yeah.
A Fairbanks student.
Happened to go to Watershed. Impromptu assembly. All right, so I was just going to keep this. I was told no elaborate PowerPoints, videos. Just I present to the board. I report to the board annually, and so you have an idea of where we've been, where we're going, and what we're doing. And so what I just wanted to do was highlight a few items from the sections in the document, in the renewal document that I submitted to you. So the first thing I was just going to go over, by the way, if you don't know, my name is Jared Decker. I'm the head teacher at Watershed, for maybe new folks. So I was just going to go over a couple, in section one of the criteria that this is the state renewal application that it asks for is to highlight changes to the charter. And I think in the first 10 years, there's probably quite a bit because when you're starting with a dream and you don't have students in seats, your vision of what your school will be versus what you are 10 years later can be quite different. So a couple of those. One is a reduction in thematic math instruction, and so when we started, we said that 20% of our math instruction would directly correlate to our place-based science and social studies units. And so we found we found a really great math program that we really find to be very successful and really promote student learning. And we found that there wasn't a meaningful way to commit one day of the week to that thematic instruction without disrupting the flow of math instruction. And I'm talking about beyond just changing the wording of a story problem in third grade. And by the way, I'm totally comfortable being interrupted anytime anybody has questions. Another change was with the lottery. There's been a few changes with the lottery. So the lottery preference for APC. Yep.
You want something about the lottery, or would you already
know about the thematic math?
Okay. Mr. Doran.
Could you explain that a little bit more to me? It sounds like originally you were looking at 4 days of math, and fifth day was a math, science, social studies integration, or you're going to you did it by time, or you did it by integration? What does this mean?
I believe that the percentage was a target so that math wouldn't become an island of its own that wasn't connected to other subjects that students were learning. The difficulty with it, and so 20% was set. And so I just think of 20% as a day a week.
So maybe then, are you looking at you're looking at the math, the interdisciplinary piece of math?
Yes.
And how it applies in science. So, for instance, in science, you're doing measurements, metrics, things of this sort, which is math application within that, appropriate for the grade level. And so that, let's say a measuring activity in science that is applying math, so that actually you might be giving 110% to math because of that, or in social studies when you're looking at BC, AD, whatever, span of years. You can apply math a lot of times. It's one of the easiest ones I come to, in terms of span of years. So being conscious of using that in applying math in the science and social studies, or actually in the math instruction itself, bringing science and social studies into that?
So I'll try to answer that from when I was a teacher and how I looked at that criteria. I consider that to be 20% of my math instructional time, right? Because there is that crossover especially in science. There's so much crossover with math and science, or integration, I should say, in science. And so I just thought of it as, okay, if I'm teaching an hour and a half of math every day, then that's what I'm thinking is 5 times a week, for one of those sessions, an hour and a half a week, I need to integrate a thematic math lesson that reflects what we're doing, that reflects either the science or social studies that we're studying in class, but also is relevant to the sequence of math that has been taught. And that's where the challenge came in, is doing that, is meeting both those. I think we have a great, and then if we look at it as 20 or what's now 10% of math instruction, now we can look at it as the amount of math that we integrate into science and into social studies.
Okay, so when you look at your thematic, you're using the term thematic math, you're looking at 90% in traditional math instruction, 10% taking place of math instruction taking place in science and social studies?
Yes.
Okay, as opposed to 100% math and 10% additional application?
I think that's correct, yes.
Okay, so first. Okay, and the other question I had just before we get too far down is you mentioned things change 10 years ago, place-based, lots of discussions about it, and there's lots of information out there on it. Where's place-based for you now? What's your understanding as you move into the next 10 years? Has that changed, grown?
That's a big question, Mr. Doran. So I don't think I want to make sure I answer it correctly or address it. I don't think the way we are identifying or defining place-based education has changed. I think the way that we go about place-based education continues to evolve, just like all education evolves. I think I think we have changed some approaches to how we teach in a place-based manner. But I still think, and I'll try to be brief here. I still think the root of place-based instruction is the same, and developing a framework closest to the child early on, and then building out from that. I think that still remains the same. And then finding those meaningful connections, especially as kids get older, to family, to community, neighborhood, community, state, and then, the nation beyond.
Thank you. When I get to come visit, we'll talk more.
Okay, sounds good.
Because I want to keep learning.
I know
what you're doing.
I know you'll come visit. So next change, lottery. Lottery has been a point of conversation with the board over the past 4 or 5 years. So probably the biggest item is that the lottery preference for the APC has been removed. Another preference that exists is a Smith Ranch neighborhood preference, and so the Smith Ranch neighborhood is the neighborhood surrounding watershed, and so that is from Dale Road to the river. We have a good barrier there. Dale Road to the river, and to where Dale Road and then it extends down to where there are no more houses, down past Trailbreaker Kennel. That's where it ends. Down on the levee system.
So those students weren't already walking students to your school?
They weren't already walking students?
Yeah, because I thought when you have a charter, if students in that area are walkers, they're welcomed anyway. They're not a part of the lottery. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. It wasn't correct when we opened. I think it's a little different than with a magnet. Yeah, so that wasn't when we opened. I believe the Smith Ranch preference was included a year after we opened to serve students in our school community, in our school neighborhood, I'll say. And so that is so two seats there are reserved for students from if there are two students from the neighborhood who apply, then if there's room, then 2 seats. I'm saying this really wrong. So 2 seats per classroom are reserved for Smith Ranch kids.
Ms. Marati.
So you were mentioning that was a change. What was it changing from?
No preference, no neighborhood preference.
Oh.
Originally that's what we had.
Gotcha. And now it's 2 seats.
Yes.
Okay.
For Smith Ranch. Yep.
Thank you.
And then this is mostly just the last item that I was thinking of as far as lottery changes is just kind of an easing of access. Is parents, as of last year, parents are no longer required to attend an informational meeting in order to have their students apply for the school. We entered slightly into the digital era and have our enrollment lottery application online, and it's fillable by a PDF. So just remove that one possible barrier of informational meetings.
Mr. Doran?
So 2 clarifications on the lottery. So if you have 3 openings at a grade level, and you might fill 2 of those from Smith Ranch and then have 1 from the general lottery.
That's correct. If there are no other, if that class has 0 Smith Ranch kids and there are 3 openings and 2 Smith Ranch kids apply, they're in.
Okay. All right. And then would you talk a little bit about the gender balance piece and maybe what you've seen over the years, how imbalanced it is in terms of the numbers of who even apply? Or are you?
So the gender balance was, I'd have to go into the minutes to figure out exactly when the gender balance was put in. I believe the gender balance was put in our 2nd year along with the Smith Ranch preference. And that was put in because we had a significant higher population of boys than we did girls. And then, just anecdotal, it became, there was, the previous head teacher was addressing quite a few concerns that we were becoming a boys' school, and from both existing parents and from parents of students outside, prospective parents as well. And so the gender balancing mechanism was put into place, and ironically, the first time it was used that next year was because we reached 14 girls in a lottery before we had an equivalent number of boys, and so that was the first time it was used. It comes into play every 2 or 3 years, I would say, and so and we set the number at 14 out of 22, which is kind of in line to what the Anchorage School District does as well, as far as their balancing. And and overall we have more boys than girls. And that's been the
I have a question.
Yes, Ms. Lambert.
On the gender balancing, and this is probably more for the administration, but I thought we had a discussion on this for the Discovery Peak charter school when they were going through their process about whether we could have gender balancing during the lottery, and I thought the answer was no, but I might have misunderstood. So can somebody comment on that?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about when this was put in place and when that decision out of Juneau came, and I think the decision out of Juneau came after, so that might be something we have to look at. Because I believe, I don't even remember which court determined it was not legal.
And that was my question as well, would just be to check right now, the way 14.03, which is the statute that affects charters and admission, does not say anything about allowing for gender balance. So that was one of the questions that we came up with as well. So I just was wondering if you had checked on that in terms of current statute and is it allowable, because I thought we had some questions that was indicating it might not be.
I think the decision that came out of Juneau, again, what has it been, about 5 years ago now, was a charter school can't have any type of weighted lottery. But it's been since, yeah. So definitely further, and we can assist with that, Jared, just to look into that.
All right, yeah, if you could just check on that, that would be great.
All right, I'll check on that as well. I informally talked with, I go to a charter school conference, charter school principal conference, their principals know it, in Anchorage every year, and I checked with the supervisor of the charter school, the superintendent, the assistant superintendent who supervises charter schools in ASD, and he directed me to their board policy, but I didn't, I'll admit, I didn't check that against state statute, so I will check that again.
I'll find out. I know.
Thank you.
Ms. Anderson.
Diversity, what's the diversity of your student population, demographic-wise?
Currently, let's see, I can actually, if you don't mind, I can pull up my Power School, and I can tell you my current enrollment. I include the demographics of our school in every report to the board too. So if you go back into previous board reports, those are, well, at least for the last 4 years that I've been writing those board reports, those are always in there as well. So
I would like to commend Jared especially on the diversity issue, because we had a big discussion about it, and I want to say how long have you been there, Jared?
This is my 5th year.
I thought it was 5 years ago when he first took over. There was a big discussion about watershed diversity, and they have implemented a lot of things to support diversity. But the biggest problem that I see with diversity for watershed is it's an outdoorsy school, and I know a lot of parents have said they don't want their kids outside during the wintertime doing all that exercise and skiing and things of that nature and trying to get there. The transportation issue. I don't know if you ever got transportation. Did you all do transportation, or were you one of the ones that didn't? I'm sorry. Now
my report. Yeah, we do have transportation for the past. I think this is our 3rd year with afternoon busing.
Oh, okay. So
we run a shuttle system similar to what Effie Cochran runs.
Okay.
But we have ours in the afternoon because of scheduling, because they would having busing before and after school using that shuttle system would crunch our school day, and we didn't want to do that, so we have after school busing.
Well, I appreciate you doing that. That way we can get some more kids there. Did you have many openings at any level this year, or are you going to get to that?
Sure, I can get to it. I think we have. I think non-sibling, and this is going to be guessing. I don't have those numbers directly in front of me, so it's just going to be my best recollection. I believe non-kindergarten or non-sibling kindergarten, our enrollment was, I think we drew a lottery. I think we drew 15 out of 22 kids going into kindergarten, which is a pretty high number for us. Usually we have a lot more siblings and staff kids going in. So no siblings, fewer siblings, fewer staff kids going in. And then we had, I think, 4 or 5 non-kindergarten kids come in this new non-kindergarten kids come in.
Mr. Dorn?
Just so I have the right perspective on it, when you noted through here changes to the original charter, I had read them as in terms of these are changes in the new one as relatively new, but it sounds like a lot of these things you've actually had in place for quite some time.
Yes, I looked back. I've been using that original charter, and I looked through it, and these are things that are in place that have changed since. I consider that charter our agreement, right, between our APC, our school, and the district. And any changes in that charter should be reported to you as part of this agreement between our two bodies.
All right. Okay. If there's anything in this as we go forward that has not been in place but is really new, projecting forward, maybe bring that to our attention. I'm interested. What's the next 10 years? And if there are things that are coming along that are going to happen as opposed to things that have been in place for quite a while, though which are updates to that charter, but whether there's actually some additional changes, I'll look for.
That's a good question, and we talked about that when you visited last year. I don't have a lot of what's in this document. The way I read this renewal application was more justify your existence for the last 10 years than give us a vision for what the next 10 years is. So a lot of it is going to be looking at where we are now and what we have done rather than looking forward.
Ms. Moratti?
So have you had time to determine the effectiveness of the charter school by tracking the kids and seeing how successful they've been?
Do you mean tracking students as far as measuring their success after they leave our school?
Correct.
No, there's a lot of, no, I haven't. I think there's a lot of hurdles to that as far as privacy, and so I
don't mean like personally tracking, but maybe like graduation rates, since there's been enough time for them to graduate, and academically.
No, I haven't been able to track that.
Let me let you go on. Not unless we've answered all your questions.
I think we're doing great. You guys just keep firing questions. We'll do it this way. And then one of the other changes that happened pretty early on, but has been revisited by the APC, is an attendance policy. And the reason, and so there was not an original attendance policy at the school. And what we found is early on is that this, Watershed being a school of choice, many people thought the choice was whether or not to show up to school. And so we had a really high tardy and absence rate for the first couple of years. And so coupling a high absence and tardy rate with wait lists of students who want to get into the building, we developed this attendance policy that is, again, as something else that has evolved over time. And so now it's a fairly, what I would consider to be just a fairly clear and clean policy that's 25, it's a 25-day absent policy. When a student reaches 25 days, when they lose their place for the following year. We don't kick anybody out mid-year because they hit 25 days. If they hit 25 days, on April 3rd, which we've had students do, their spot in the school isn't, they're not kicked out of school. It just means that they need to then appeal to the board to have that spot for the following year. And then we also have a mechanism. We convert 8 tardies equals one day absence as well. And so, and 25 days is for family trips, illness. We consider that to be a pretty high number. 5 full weeks of school is quite a bit of absences missed. So, quite a few days missed of school. So that's why we set that number so high, is to, be forgiving of family trips and emergencies that come up. And there's also still an appeal process, so people can still appeal to the board.
Mr. Dorn?
Since waiting list was just mentioned, do you have much of a waiting list?
Yeah, that's in I have current numbers in the renewal document that I can look up and find for you. We have our highest waiting list, as you can imagine, is in kindergarten, and those numbers are usually in the 50s, and then they drop down a bit after, once we get to second, third grade, and then.
But your drop in kindergarten, this was because the district went district-wide kindergarten?
No, actually, we haven't noticed a big drop in kindergarten after the district went full day. If you see, this year we had 53 students on our kindergarten wait list, and in 2015, 2016, we had 53 students on our kindergarten wait list. And so this is on page 121. Thanks, Jason. And so the number of kindergarten students on the wait list are 53, 57, 56, 53, so fairly consistent in the 50s. This year we have 22 in second, 11 in third, 17 kids in fourth grade, 10 in fifth grade, 8 in sixth, 13 in seventh grade, and 4 in eighth grade. Or I should say, those are waitlist numbers for when we started the school year, or once we held the lottery last year. So some of those waitlists are actually not lower now, because some of those students have been called and have declined, and then we go to somebody else who's now in the building. All right, with that, I want to turn it over to Jason to talk about APC and APC bylaws.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jason Gillum. I am the APC chair. I was elected to the APC in spring of 2017. And when that was my son, my oldest, was finishing his first year of kindergarten, I saw the announcement to calling for people to serve on the APC. I read that, said I can do that, and here I am. So one of the first things that we were talking about as APC when I first joined was that, obviously, in preparation for charter renewal coming up in this year, so we really need to take a look at our bylaws as APC. The original bylaws for the Watershed School were actually written when it was a nonprofit group looking with that big dream pie in the sky to have a school started. So those bylaws really read as a nonprofit and were not very reflective of a governing body for a school. So even though the APC had been, and again, I've only been since 2017, but the APC had obviously been working as a governing body, but didn't really have a structured bylaws to really refer to. And so we tasked ourselves to definitely make sure we put those together that were reflective of the purpose and the function for our school. So we started looking at originally our bylaws. We looked at a few other bylaws as templates, and we put together a committee that, and we sat and kind of went through bullet point by bullet point, and put together. I believe our bylaws, our current bylaws, are on page 43, Appendix C, of that renewal document. Some changes some of the largest highlighted changes that we had for our APC bylaws was we wanted to where we define what the membership was. And Jared, correct me if I'm wrong, but the original membership of the APC also included a community member or two. Is that correct? Okay. And because, as Jared referred to a few years prior, the preference for lottery for the APC members was removed. The community members were removed from the APC. So the APC now consists of 5 voting members, 5 of which are full-time staff, 3 of which or at least 3 of which are certified teachers. And then the remaining 4 voting are parents of current watershed students. The head teacher, Mr. Decker, in this case, is a non-voting member, but he does have the ability to vote in case of a tie if we reach a standstill. Another thing that was a big point of discussion was APC elections and the eligibility of voters for those particular members of the APC, seeing it as a representative body. The 5 staff members are voted for just by staff, and the 4 parent members are voted on just by parents that are not full-time watershed employees at the time. So we try to have a representative of all stakeholders as we can on the APC. We also wanted to increase the transparency of the APC. We wanted to make sure that we just defined that we are indeed following the Open Meetings Act, and that we announce our meetings to the entire school community. They are open. We do them in a classroom on the 3rd Thursday of every month, but they are open to anyone. There's always more chairs. If anyone has any concern, if there are any concerns to be brought to the board, the board also anyone, any stakeholders in the school are welcome to draft a policy if they want to change, suggest or a policy changed. They can draft a proposal, and the APC will consider it and vote. So we pretty much went through that most of the school year last year. We went through that whole bylaw process, going through a number of debates, kind of back and forth, and we adopted the current version you see in front of you in April of this year.
Mr. Doran?
Could you update us on the APC is now 9 members. What was it before?
It was 11.
It was 11, okay. So maybe the change, and was it predominantly staff before your makeup? And so I guess part of my question is, why predominantly staff versus parents? I think you did address an 11 versus 9, if I remember correctly. You're just trying to get enough people together and stuff. But is there the rationale in that balance of staff versus parents?
Yeah, I could take that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jared, but I believe those 2 spots were originally community members. Yes. Those extra 2. So once those 2 spots were removed from the APC, 11 minus 2 last time I checked was 9. So that's what we kept it there. And then we just it was a extensive discussion, a large moment of discussion of how that should be distributed between whether staff and parents. We kind of went back and forth to try to create a representative body for the school. And I know I personally argued that if we are going to have staff be the majority of that 9, that and I'm perfectly happy doing that because I trust in our professional educators to make good decisions. I just want our parent input as well. I personally argue very hardly that the staff should elect staff and parents should elect parents. It shouldn't be parents electing the staff members. It gets favoritism in that sense. So I see myself as a parent representative. Whenever we have an opportunity that we're going to make a policy change, I'm usually the one in the room saying, can we do a survey? Can we send out an email? I talk to people I work with. I have coworkers, or I have a coworker who has students in school. I bounce ideas off of people as much as I can.
And with my question, I don't mean to imply a feeling one way or the other, but I was curious what the thinking process was in terms of establishing that, especially as you've reviewed it, and I think your distinction of looking at it now as a governing body as opposed to an organizing body, it's very, very timely and well done.
Any other questions? Just for the APC, I don't know if Jared has anything else that you would like to present.
Sure. Well, I'll just go with Section 3. Section 3 has a little snapshot of what place-based curriculum, our approach to outdoor education, which is embedded in our place-based education, and it has a little, that includes some teaching methods, and that's based on, and I think that part of the renewal document gives the best. It's a little snapshot of the school based on grade level loops. So we watershed loops after kindergarten. So first and second graders have the same teacher. Then they move on to a new teacher in third and fourth. And so that's how that section of the document was written. So that's in Section 3. And then in Section 3, it also includes information just a brief paragraph about special education, and then it also has student achievement scores based on standardized tests, which are there for you to review as well. And if you're interested in test scores, those are on Appendix N, page 156.
Mr. Doran.
Okay, this is probably for administration. On page 18, there's a reference to NCLB, which I think is the state form. Has the state updated their form?
On what page is that, Mr. Doran?
18. And it asks them to respond to aspects of NCLB. The school responded more appropriately in saying that it's adequate yearly progress is no longer part of the deal, but has the state updated their form?
Assuming you're using the form they gave you.
I am using the most outdated form I can find on the ED website.
This looks exactly like the form that I have printed and that Jared is using. So without going into detail about the state updating things, sounds like they're behind, yes.
Great. Okay, thanks. My other question, which I've actually asked you before, but came to mind quickly, in terms of the PEAKS AMP scores that you cite in here, it's approximately 30% of your students non-proficient.
Approximately 30% of our students were not proficient in PEAKS last year.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So that, aside from the PEAK score, according to the PEAK score, if we use those scores, and again it addresses the effectiveness question, would you say that, forget the scores, would you say that 30% of your students are non-proficient?
This is another big question, Mr. Doran. I don't know if I would say that a third of our students are not proficient. but we have to operate within the system in which we exist, and that system is the state system in which proficiency has a clear definition of 500, a score of 500, or wait, am I right? Is it 500 on peaks? Come on, Mel, help me. Where there's a clear score on this one test. I don't want to go too philosophical here in this. I will say we are closer to accurate than where we were 8 years ago. I thought the numbers were more inflated 8 years ago, and I think that although I don't like to think of a third of our students not being proficient in English language arts, or slightly fewer than that in math, or I guess a third in math. I do think it's a better representation of where students are at that moment than where we were.
But to look at the PEACE scores altogether, just to add on to Mr. Dorn, when we had our presentation here, Mr. Ott basically stated that the scores weren't, I don't want to use that word, but they weren't totally accurate because we don't know what the questions were asked, or they hadn't been verified. I think you brought that up. Mm-hmm. So to say 30%, I wouldn't go with 30% either of all your students because of that flaw.
Okay, I'm in.
I'm on your side, so you don't have to say that.
I think that a major gap in this too is, I especially look at English language arts for a test that doesn't assess writing.
Exactly.
Because writing is how we communicate. Exactly. And if we're not going to assess that, I don't think that's a good representation. However, I can't say, when I factor in writing and based on our school data, I would say that 89%. I can't give a good number of what I would consider there.
Right. Okay. Well, what I might just toss out for consideration is that it might be worth looking at some paragraph around, if you have school data, that also so you're expanding your information base, and it might be qualitative even rather than quantitative, but I think it's worth addressing.
Ms. Anderson.
I just had a question, is why did you guys reference the NBLC instead of the ESSA?
Because the state has not changed their form.
The state didn't change it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So totally went somewhere else.
You just went to sleep on us.
I was like,
I mean, there's a reference above on that page 18, that AYP part.
right.
But that AYP is from the original. That's from the original charter that was written 10 years ago, and it was one of our goals that we would meet AYP, and since that hasn't been around for a while.
The questions? Ms. Lambert, you still there?
I'm here. I don't have any questions.
What time you got to get up in the morning? 6?
I'm good.
Okay, Ms. Anderson.
And then what is the makeup for as ELL students? Is that a good population of your students at all?
For ELL students? Mm-hmm. I can probably give you the number, but I got to be careful that I'm not identifying personal information here. So we have, I believe we have 5 students.
Okay.
Yeah, we have an itinerant ELL tutor who works with us.
Did you have any more to present, Mr. Jarrett?
I kind of jumped all over, and I think you've asked me questions that were in other places. I was going to leave the rest to be open for.
Okay. I just didn't want you to be excluding anything you wanted to say.
I'm willing to talk about anything.
Okay. Mr. Dorn.
Okay, I had a question on page 19 about parent surveys. Do you do your own school's survey of parents?
No, we use the school climate survey that the rest of the district uses.
Okay, and are those numbers 41 and 37 responses about how many families does that work? I mean, I'm trying to get a sense of
approximate that we have about 150 families. That's an approximation of, but yeah, so it's not a great response rate. That's why I included those numbers and included the number of parent respondents in that information.
Right. Okay. That's what I was interested in, was really what that response rate was.
Aren't you almost at 30%? Did I miss that? 47? Oh, 41 and 37?
What?
As I say, when you look at national trends around survey responses, 20% is unbelievable. So if you're above 20%, you're doing fabulous. So I just saying.
41 and 37 is good.
Don't be too hard on yourself.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Ms. Moratti.
Also on page 19, under community involvement, it notes that there's been a change to the expected community and parent volunteer kind of supplemental teaching time from 20%. What was it changed to, or has it changed in what way?
It hasn't changed, and I'm going to confess this, that I don't remember that wording ever. I've read this document, and in the review that I've done with this document this year, this one stands out to me. The APC has been alerted. This is something that the APC will be looking at, and I can't predict for the APC because I am not a voting member of the APC I would be surprised if this doesn't change, because again, this is from the original charter back when we were a dream, and the idea was that we would have such strong ties to the community, and that there would be, the walls between the school and the community would be so porous that 20% of teaching time would be given by community members and parents. And I can't. So I'm now talking as head teacher and not an APC lobbyist, but I can't imagine the amazing classroom teachers we have giving up 1/5 of their instructional time, and then having to coordinate that as well. Now I say that knowing that every teacher in the building has parent experts and community partnerships that they work with. We have an amazing relationship with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in Tevral. We have many relationships with university scientists. We have one of my favorite, and I shouldn't play favorites, but we have a wonderful partnership with the Alaska Songbird Institute. So we have a lot of, we've had businesses support us in ski instruction, but the 20% is, it just isn't attainable.
Can I just add one thing? If I can just add, I just know that both of my children's teachers, every time I'm at parent-teacher conferences, are always asking us if we have anything we want to share, anything that we're willing to teach. As parent volunteers, I've gone into classrooms with my wife, and we've taught making lefse bread to a couple different classrooms. I'm a physical therapist, and my son's second grade class is going to be doing human anatomy at some part this year, and I plan on letting Ms. O'Malley know that I'm in the classroom for that.
Great. Mr. Dorothy?
Okay, a thought that occurs to me is, because I know you have a lot of parents who help with your outdoor activities, which in many cases, you mentioned skiing, and I know you've got some phenomenal ski guides who are really instructing, imagine during your camping. So since those are overnights, that you have parents, and that you might be close to the 20% of the equivalent, not taking away from teacher time, but teachers providing hours of service. So maybe factoring that in as you look at that big picture.
Yeah, I was kind of looking at that as parent volunteering time is part of that expectation.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a meeting tomorrow night also, and it's the bewitching hour of 8:30. And I'd like to ask one question. I'll give you one more. Okay. That's all you have.
That's all I have.
You told me a half an hour ago you only had one more, but that's okay. The looping I wanted to ask you about, Jared.
Yeah.
Do you feel looping is a very effective way of keeping kids' learning ability keep rising, and where the teacher doesn't have to begin to know the kid because you had them the year before? Don't you think that's a very effective tool?
Yeah, I'm a pretty biased voice in favor of looping, having done it for 5 years in the school, and I actually think one of the benefits of it is just the relationship that you have, because I think we can talk about training and all that. I think so much learning is based on a student and a teacher having a good understanding working relationship, and I think that only grows and develops over a 2-year period versus just a single year. And then when and I can say as a teacher, that second year of the loop, you really start you're off and running from the first few minutes of the school year. It's really a benefit.
I agree. Mr. Dorn.
Okay. And this is something that you don't have to answer tonight, but looking at the professional development and good description of things you've done, I particularly resonate with the responsive classroom and things you've been doing. But maybe something looking forward. Again, what's the next step? You've been doing these for quite a number of years. Is a continuation how you can build on this foundation, but I think something in here that indicates that kind of what's next for you. It may be continuation. I mean, obviously it will be continuation of some things, but are there other things on the horizon in professional development that you're looking at that will help to enrich and build upon the foundation that you've built over the last number of years?
I'll go briefly with it. I'll try to answer you briefly. One is, for the past couple years, I haven't committed to it yet, but it's just been a conversation I've been having with staff. One is we're always messing with curriculum, so we're always revising and doing that. So that'll continue to be a part of our professional development. Writing, I think, is, and I'm going back on my soapbox about writing. I think writing is so often overlooked because it's not assessed in a standardized way at the state level. And I think of all skills, it's one of our biggest gatekeepers and an area that students need so much support. It's so important to develop strong writing skills. And so I think writing is an area where I like to see some more professional development. But again, I'm a little selective, and I've been looking at various models for that. And then if staff's listening, they're going to love this. And then grading. Grading because our kindergarten, first and second grade teachers were involved in the district discussions and meetings about moving to a standards-based report card. So we had our kindergarten teacher was involved, I believe, and I know our first grade teacher and our second grade teacher were involved in those first and second grade committees. And so that's something that we continue to look at, and then possibly expand to. But again, when I come back in May, we might not be ready for that for next year. We're not ready for that for next year. But those are a couple of things if we're going to look down the path.
Cool. Thank you.
Can I just suggest as a wrap-up, Jared, I misspoke in terms of your timeline. You actually need board action in January. So can you just explain the timeline on this to everybody?
So the timeline is after we have the formal approval from the district, we have 90 days We have 90 days to submit it to the state.
Well, actually, we need to submit it 90 days before the meeting, the state meeting that we would be.
So 30 days after board action. Within 30 days of board action, 90 days before the meeting. So the next meeting the next state board meeting is in mid-March.
March 20th, 29th, I just looked up.
Late March. Thank you, Jason.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I was thinking you had more time, and then I remembered why we needed this to happen tonight. So, yeah, a little bit faster.
Ms. Anderson? Oh, I thought you had something else. Anybody? Thank you very much, Wardy. Mr. Dorn, you finished. I'm going to bring my gavel over here so I can bang the table.
I'm just teasing.
Okay.
Just one comment.
Okay, Mr. Rice.
I always appreciate you guys coming out and, explaining all this stuff to us. So, you guys always do a great job, and I always love how informed you guys are. Just letting us ask questions whenever and then just jumping everywhere. And you still keep us on track with the information now. So thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you guys for coming out, and I appreciate you waiting for us to get through our first class. And I really didn't forget you. I'm telling you, Tim's head was right in the view. But I really appreciate all the information that you're doing, and I appreciate all the hard work that you're doing with our students. So keep up the great work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Anything else? Motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Am I second?
Second.
Okay. We're good.